Right, thank you, Keith, for inviting me here this afternoon. The background to this, Keith's already outlined that Keith approached me about a year ago and said, hey, I've read some stuff you've written about the integration of data, and we've had a kind of a dialogue going forward ever since then, which sort of gives the impression that I'm some sort of guru on data integration, and it's not quite true. It's really just that with a background in market research, you inevitably arrive at this point that with so much data around, unless you do have frameworks in order to bend your mind around this, you're kind of stranded. So it's not that I've got a kind of silver bullet solution. It's really that I'm interested in this area, and I've got a few ideas that I can actually share with you. So I guess understanding the patient experience is much the same as understanding any kind of customer experience. I'm more familiar with doing commercial research than I am in your sector, but it's much the same. I mean, I'm not going to go through all these different things here, but today, the pressure, if you're a Pepsi-Cola or a Microsoft or a Barclays Bank, is to really pull all of this stuff together to have this complete holistic picture of the customer. Now or the patient. Now the difficulty that we have here, that in my day when I started as a kind of boy researcher, it was quite simple. That I used to look at one solitary piece of data, and the principles were, is this data valid and reliable? Is it generalizable? And I used to apply fairly standard kind of statistical routines to look at that piece of data. But now, with all this stuff coming at us, it's sort of quite chaotic, isn't it? You get information where you can't quite work out the sources or the base sizes, and you've got different researchers working on the information that's being provided with different little pet ways of how they go about things. So it's quite a kind of chaotic environment to actually reach out and find out, exactly the status of all the information you've actually got. But the goal is to try and pull this together and and have an holistic picture. And this, you could go on forever about lots of examples of where this didn't happen. So we could take a kind of political example. Apparently, the US government spent umpty-tump millions trying to understand what the Russians are up to, and it takes the president to look up CNN to find out the Berlin Wall's coming down, and he wants to know why he only found out that way. You've got the police. There's whole loads of examples there. Like the Yorkshire Ripper killed 13 women. Apparently, when they eventually apprehended this guy, he was the only person that had all of the 4 pieces of incriminating evidence, and he'd been interviewed 13 times by the police, but they never had a way of putting the information together. Harold Shetland may be more familiar to you in the medical field. All the 4 pieces of incriminating evidence about this guy, in terms of his patient home visits, his recreational drug abuse record, etc., etc. Again, all of that information was there, but there was never a mechanism for pulling it together. And in commerce, you've got big fiascos like the Royal Mail Consignia fiasco, where they rebranded all the brands and called them Consignia. That's because they had a kind of inside view that consignia was the word we all use to consign parcels and consign letters. Whereas if they had an outside-in view, it'd be quite clear that we rarely say, people do consign it to the post office. We only use it to sort of like, that football manager's consigned to history, or we consign that to the rubbish bin. So, so the examples of where not being able to put things together has led to disaster are quite commonplace. Sorry, I'm just jumping ahead. Right. So on just a few words about best practice. So is there a best practice about how mobile phone operators, airline companies, grocery stores, banks go about integrating data? And there isn't really. I mean, I've tried to study how they actually do things, and I haven't got time here to provide a complete account, but just to sort of reassure you, there isn't a kind of silver bullet. So you have one approach might be that a company may appoint a lead market research agency to simply aggregate together all of the information that has been conducted for them on a particular topic, and the lead agency then do a kind of meta-analysis. So the main approach there is kind of laddering up to the big concepts and identifying, you know, the key issues, and then they may have other techniques where they look at those concepts and question them and arrive at a particular solution. There's an FMCG company in Switzerland I did some work for them recently. They have the notion of kind of like the data wall. They will actually get, for literally, they go into a room and there's a wall where it's just a sea of different post-it notes with every snippet of information that they can actually find on this particular problem. And they use the data wall as a kind of integration device. Other companies have the idea of taking all their segmentation data, and some of them call it a kind of like a means-end chain, some of them call it like a what do they call it, sort of not a personality profile, but a persona profile, where they try and infill from the data they've got using best judgment to say, you know, what would that person look like? The data tells us so much about this particular customer. How can we infill and turn a black and white picture into a kind of colour picture? So it's a kind of workshop facilitation technique to arrive at the emotional benefits that drive that particular situation, although they may only be working with basic behavioural data. So there's, I've probably haven't got time to go through all of the different styles, but I think the point I want to make, there isn't a kind of silver bullet. The exception would be around certain specialist work that you'll be familiar with. One would be the guys working on the census. They're quite tight mathematical data fusion models for linking together census data with other forms of data. And you've got Dunn and Humby at Tesco's, where they've got very tight formal approaches for linking together Tesco's data. But on the quant side, that is the exception. For most commercial problems where you've got all of that kind of data that I alluded to before, the approaches are just incredibly kind of pragmatic. Now, so the problem you have with that, and this is where the kind of market research industry is a little bit torn at the minute. If you went along to the Market Research Society conference, you've got a bunch of guys saying, look, it's all going to hell in a handbasket here because we need valid, replicable, reliable, generalizable data. And all the conferences about people wandering around saying, hey, talk to me about co-creation and talk to me about, we research and all this sort of thing. So, but of course the answer is people want both, don't you? We want to have that solid data and we want the insights. And that's the problem, is the sort of, I'm doing a project at the moment on the demand for postgraduate education in the UK. And the objectives of that study combine both of these things. I've got to present next week about solid data. X% of people have expressed an interest in postgraduate study in these subjects. But then there's a whole bunch of other objectives where, what are the insights, what are the barriers and frustrations, what are people going to actually want in the future in terms of a different sort of delivery. So there is a kind of tension here between the rigour and the creativity.